Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into the entangled story of Egypt and Britain, how ancient bonds set the stage for imperial ambitions. Let's start at the beginning. Picture the Mediterranean as the world's original group chat, merchants hopping between ports, passing along messages, spices, and grain, papyrus, and metals. Egypt is the old friend everyone wants in the chat, fertile fields, skilled scribes, and workshops humming with craft. Britain, way off on the misty edge of Europe, isn't texting Egypt directly yet, it's replying through intermediaries, Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans, who carry goods and ideas from the Nile to the Atlantic. That matters. Why? Because even without a direct line, patterns of exchange begin to link these two worlds. Over time, commerce creates familiarity, and familiarity creates interest. Interest has a way of growing into strategy. Now, fast forward to the 19th century. The map changes not because the land moves, but because someone digs a shortcut. Enter the Suez Canal. Suddenly, Egypt isn't just Egypt, it's the hinge of the planet. From the Mediterranean to the Red Sea in a single cut, the long sail around Africa becomes a quick pivot. That means time saved, costs lowered, and routes protected. Ask yourself, if global trade is the bloodstream of the 19th century, what is Egypt? The artery. Whoever influences that artery influences the flow of wealth, power, and projection. No wonder the great powers treated Egypt like a strategic prize. Control the gateway, shape the game. But gateways invite gatekeepers. After the Urabi revolt in 1882, a nationalist surge that alarmed investors and officials alike, Britain steps in, calling the move stabilization, security, a kind of geopolitical housekeeping. And yet, look closely at what follows. Stabilization becomes presence. Presence becomes habit. Habits, once budgeted and staffed, become policy. The banner says order, the effect is dominance. It's a story told often in the age of empires. A crisis opens the door, but it's economics and logistics that keep the furniture inside. Which brings us to the economic footprint. Think cotton. Egyptian fields turn out the fiber that feeds British mills, and the mills feed British cities. When an empire directs the export tap and tweaks taxation to match its own fiscal priorities, incentives shift on the ground. What farmers plant, what officials measure, what administrators reward. Revenue streams are rechanneled, often with impressive spreadsheets and tidy ledgers. But those spreadsheets tell a story about power: who sets the price, who collects the tax, who decides what efficiencies means. The language is financial, the consequences are social. When a single set of priorities sits at the top, local choices start to narrow. Farmers optimize for the metropole. Administrators optimize for remittances. Over time, a landscape designed for diversity of uses begins to serve a very specific demand curve. So on this first slide, remember the arc. Early connections through trade. A canal that turns Egypt into the world's shortcut. An occupation framed as stability that solidifies into control. And beneath it all, an economic footprint pressed deep into cotton rows and tax ledgers. The stage is set. The actors are in place. The question is what happens when culture, governance, and everyday life are asked to march to the beat of distant priorities. Now that the foundations of British influence in Egypt are set, let's walk into the heart of cultural exchange, and, just as importantly, cultural tension. This isn't a one-way imposition, it's a messy, fascinating two-way street. First, the British reforms. Imagine Cairo in the late 1800s and early 1900s, new courtrooms built in the Western mold, judges in black robes applying codes modeled on European legal systems. Schools teaching in English alongside Arabic, producing a generation fluent in the language of the empire but wrestling with the identity it carried. Municipal governance shifts toward British administrative efficiency, records filed in neat columns, public works budgeted down to the last piaster. On paper, it's order. But look closer, and you see what's missing: local autonomy. Decisions once made in Cairo or Alexandria now pass through a British filter before becoming law. Efficiency becomes the official story. Marginalization is the subtext. Then there's the urban landscape. Cairo begins to mirror Paris. Wide boulevards cut through older districts, grand facades replace winding alleys, and public squares take shape to match European aesthetics. Street lamps glow at night. Bridges arch elegantly over the Nile. The city becomes a stage set for modernity, but whose modernity? For many Egyptians, these changes feel like walking through someone else's architectural dream, where the beauty is undeniable, but so is the sense of cultural displacement. But history loves complexity. The traffic in this cultural crossroads doesn't only flow one way. Egyptian scholars, artists, and political thinkers start making their mark on Britain. In lecture halls, Orientalist studies absorb perspectives shaped by Egyptian intellectuals. Art exhibitions in London showcase works inspired by the colors, textures, and histories of the Nile. Even political debates in Britain occasionally reflect ideas that began in Cairo's coffeehouses and newspapers. Culture, it seems, refuses to stay in neat boxes. And then there's archaeology, a field where science, ambition, and politics intertwine. British-led excavations uncover treasures buried for millennia, fueling the birth of Egyptology as a discipline. But with every statue, sarcophagus, or papyrus that sails north, debates flare. Is this cultural preservation or cultural plunder? Diplomacy often frames these finds as scholarly achievements, yet the undercurrent is about ownership, about who tells the story of a nation's past, and who holds the keys to its artifacts. So this two-way street is not just about exchanging ideas. It's about negotiating identity under the weight of power. British courts in Egyptian cities, Parisian boulevards in Cairo, Egyptian voices influencing British academia, and the artifacts of Egypt's deep past becoming bargaining chips in the present. This is the middle of the story, where the human and the political blur into one, and where every borrowed idea or building carries a trace of the unequal relationship that brought it into being. By this point, the British presence in Egypt is deeply woven into the country's institutions, economy, and daily life. But when power is imposed, resistance often germinates quietly, like seeds under a hard-packed road, until the right moment comes to break through. The rise of nationalism in Egypt is one of those moments. Picture the voices of leaders like Mustafa Kemal and Saad Zaghloul, lawyers, orators, and political organizers, standing before crowds, calling for dignity, self-rule, and the end of foreign control. Their speeches aren't just politics, they are sparks. And those sparks find ready tinder among a population tired of being told what progress looks like from across the Mediterranean. Movements begin to swell, and what once seemed like scattered protests start taking shape as a national resistance with its own leaders, strategies, and vision. But nationalism isn't born in a vacuum, it's often fueled by something tangible. In this case, the economic drivers of resistance are impossible to ignore. Land policies that favor large estates and foreign investors push many Egyptians into dependency. Taxation channels wealth out of rural villages and into imperial coffers. Concentrated economic power means decisions about Egypt's resources are made to serve British priorities first. If you're a farmer paying high taxes on cotton you were told to plant for export, it's not abstract, you feel the control in your own fields, in the prices you get, and in the debts you can't escape. Economic policy becomes political fuel. Then comes the world at war, and not once, but twice. In both the First and Second World Wars, Egypt's strategic location and logistical capacity become vital to Britain's war effort. Ports, railways, and the Suez Canal become lifelines for Allied movement and supply. But this military importance also magnifies Egypt's bargaining position. If your land is central to global conflict, you have leverage, or at least the hope of it, when the war ends. These moments shape the debates about sovereignty, even as Britain tries to keep its grip firm. That brings us to 1922. On paper, Egypt gains independence. The flags wave, speeches declare a new chapter. But the fine print tells another story. Treaty constraints keep Britain in control of defense, foreign policy, and, most importantly, the Suez Canal. Autonomy becomes conditional. It's like getting the keys to your house while someone else still controls the locks on all the doors that matter. So here, the seeds of resistance have sprouted into something visible, a national movement driven by both ideals and economic necessity. The alliances shift with global wars, promises are made and partially fulfilled, and the question of who truly governs Egypt becomes the central thread. This is where resistance starts turning from scattered uprisings into organized political and economic defiance, setting the stage for the crises and confrontations yet to come. By the mid-20th century, Egypt's struggle for sovereignty has been simmering for decades. And then, in 1956, it boils over into one of the most dramatic confrontations of the post-war world, the Suez Crisis. Here's how it unfolds. Gamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt's charismatic leader, announces the nationalization of the Suez Canal. This isn't just a bureaucratic change, it's a thunderclap. The canal, once the artery of Britain's imperial trade routes, is now claimed for Egypt to fund its own national projects. In London and Paris, alarm bells ring. The canal isn't just about shipping, it's about control, prestige, and economic leverage. Within months, Britain, France, and Israel launch a coordinated military intervention. They expect a quick victory. Instead, they collide with the new realities of a world divided between superpowers. That brings us to the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union both step in, not out of shared love for Egypt's sovereignty, but to assert their own influence. Under intense international pressure, Britain and France are forced to withdraw. For Britain, it's more than a military setback, it's a symbolic loss of status. The empire that once controlled seas now finds itself overruled on the global stage. Egypt, meanwhile, emerges with its nationalist credentials burnished, even as it navigates the dangerous currents of Cold War politics. Economically, the loss of the canal cuts deep for Britain. Without direct control, its ability to project power in the Middle East diminishes. Trade routes once secured by British oversight now operate beyond its reach. For a country that had built much of its 19th and early 20th century wealth on controlling key global choke points, this is a profound shift. Economic influence gives way to diplomatic persuasion, a much softer tool in a region where hard leverage had once been the norm. And yet, history rarely ends in a single moment. Over time, Britain and Egypt recalibrate. Tensions give way to cooperation in areas like trade, education, and security. The relationship becomes less about direct control and more about mutual benefit, though a mutual is always a complicated word in international politics. Old rivalries evolve into new partnerships, but the memory of the Suez Crisis lingers as a reminder: control, once lost, is rarely regained in the same form. So in this chapter, we see how a single decision, the nationalization of a canal, can trigger a cascade of military action, geopolitical realignment, and long-term economic change. And in the ripples of that decision, we glimpse a larger truth about power. It's never just about what you hold, but about how long you can hold it in a world that's always shifting under your feet. By now, we've followed Egypt and Britain through centuries of trade, empire, conflict, and shifting alliances. But history doesn't just sit neatly in the past, it leaves fingerprints all over the present. And if you look closely, those prints are everywhere. Let's start with institutions. Many of Egypt's legal structures, military organization, and even elements of its educational system still bear the marks of the British era. Court procedures, administrative hierarchies, and training protocols reflect methods introduced under imperial governance. Over time, these systems have been adapted, reshaped, and, in some cases, reclaimed, but the bones of their design remain. Think of it as inheriting a house. You can paint the walls, change the furniture, and knock out a few partitions, but the frame still tells you who built it. Language is another legacy. English remains widely used in business, academia, and diplomacy in Egypt. It's not the everyday language of the street, but it's the language of contracts, research papers, and international negotiations. In that sense, the linguistic link is like a bridge that never fully came down, allowing commerce and cultural exchange to flow more easily, even decades after the political ties loosened. Then there's shared cultural heritage, though this one is complicated. Museums in Britain house some of Egypt's most prized artifacts, mummies, statues, manuscripts, collected during the height of imperial exploration. In Egypt, some see these collections as cultural treasures preserved for the world, others see them as spoils that should return home. This debate over ownership isn't just about objects, it's about narrative control. Who gets to tell the story of Egypt's past, and whose voice carries the most weight? And let's not forget the personal narratives. Families still share stories of grandparents who lived under British rule, memories of work, education, military service, or political activism during those decades. These aren't the grand headlines of history, but they're the lived experiences that color how people understand the relationship between the two countries today. For some, it's a history of opportunity, for others, it's one of limitation. And often, it's both. Even in scholarship, the conversation continues. Historians, economists, and political scientists debate the real impact of British rule, whether it modernized Egypt or distorted its development, whether the economic ties that remain are a benefit or a lingering form of dependency. These aren't academic squabbles, they shape how policies are made, how trade deals are signed, and how each country imagines the other. So beyond the archives, the Egypt-Britain relationship is still alive, in language, institutions, museums, and memory. And the lesson here is clear: empires may fade from the map, but their architecture, both physical and invisible, can last for generations. We've walked through centuries of trade, imperial expansion, cultural exchange, nationalist struggle, and geopolitical upheaval. Now, we arrive at the part of history that matters most for today, the reflections and the questions we still can't fully answer. One of the clearest patterns is how centralized power shapes outcomes. Under British rule, Egypt's economy and governance were structured to serve the needs of the empire. This meant that incentives, from what crops farmers planted to how infrastructure was built, were designed with distant priorities in mind. When decision-making is concentrated in a small circle far from the people affected, the system may run efficiently on paper, but it often distorts what's best for those living under it. And those distortions leave long shadows. We can also see how these centralized systems, once set in motion, are hard to dismantle. Even after independence, some of the same structures remained in place because they were deeply embedded in the machinery of government and trade. This raises a broader question: How much of a nation's sovereignty is about flags and borders, and how much is about controlling the levers of policy, finance, and production? Decentralization, returning more power to local institutions and communities, often appears in historical hindsight as a missed opportunity. Yet, in the moment, it was rarely pursued, because those holding power rarely choose to give it up voluntarily. The British legacy in Egypt is a study in how control can persist in forms less visible than military occupation, through economic dependence, bureaucratic habits, and cultural influence. And then there are the questions we can't fully answer, but which are worth asking anyway. If Egypt had been allowed greater autonomy earlier, would it have developed along a different economic path? Would the Suez Canal have remained a lightning rod for global conflict, or could it have become a model of cooperative international management? And perhaps the most intriguing question of all, how do nations today avoid repeating the same patterns of control and dependency, only dressed up in modern language? History rarely hands us neat solutions, but it does give us patterns, warning signs, and the echoes of choices made long ago. And it's in studying those echoes that we understand not just what happened, but why it still matters. So as we close this journey from ancient bonds to imperial ambitions, from resistance to recalibration, remember, these stories are not dusty relics. They're blueprints, showing us the risks, the costs, and sometimes the unintended consequences of power that reaches too far from its own shores. If you enjoyed this exploration, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. And if you want to dig deeper into hidden chapters of our past, check out my book, History They Tried to Erase. You'll find the link in the description. And of course, if thoughtful, entertaining history is your thing, there's plenty more waiting for you right here on Truth Behind History.